You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Hilton brings you new ways to stay, with experiences that let you capture the glory days. Introducing the Graduate Hotels. Each inspired by local college towns, these stays are always original and never boring. Get in touch with traditions all across the country and enjoy a stay that's a class above the rest. Book at Graduate Hotels with Hilton Honors Points at Hilton.com. It's a win-win. Hilton, for the stay.
They cut in entire passages that Jefferson wrote. They changed his wording. They rewrote the final paragraph, which to them was the most important paragraph. That's where they declared independence.
These united colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connections between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved.
We today focus on that second paragraph with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, self-evident truths. They breezed over that back then. The writing style in the 18th century was you built to a crescendo and you made your point at the end. So they declare independence at the very end.
That is Thomas McMillan. He is the author of The Year That Made America, and I'm going to be talking to him today.
Congress added some of their own phrases to strengthen that. They thought that was the most important paragraph.
Do you remember the solicitude, the labors, the fears and sorrows, sleepless nights of the men who protected, proposed, defended, and subscribed the Declaration of Independence? Benjamin Rush writes to John Adams years after these events in 1811. And the date that he's describing when they all got up from the table and signed is not July 4th, 1776. It's August 2nd, 1776, when it was decided as a move of resolve that the members of the body who had voted for independence, really on July 2nd, would actually put their names on the document. As our author Tom McMillan will tell us later, no one actually signs the Declaration on July 4th, not even John Hancock. Not even John Hancock.
You know, what they did on July 4th was approve the Declaration. That's really all that happened that day. But the reason I give a talk, people say, well, why do we focus so much on July 4th? After that day, they sent it out to the printer. And they sent printed copies, which were not signed until August. The first printed copy was not signed by anyone, handwritten. But and those were published in local papers and read in town squares. Many people heard this for the first time by readings in town squares.
7 other delegates signed after that date. So you'll actually get into 1777 before Thomas McKean, the last to sign, has signed the document. Here's what McMillan writes. Confusion has reigned almost since the time of the signing, fueled by the delegates' need for secrecy after breaking with England. The first mention of a potential signing process does not even appear in the congressional records until July 19th, following word of New York's delayed vote. That is when Congress called for an updated version of the July 4th document to be engrossed on parchment, and once it was completed, signed by every member. Timothy Matlock, the engrosser's work, took the better part of 2 weeks. An engrosser is someone who has a very, very good penmanship. His work took the better part of 2 weeks because it was not until August 2nd that Congress let its private daily record with the understated news, the Declaration of Independence, being engrossed and compared at the table, was signed by the members. That was it, McMillan says. It's no fanfare, there's no celebration, no leaks to the gazettes. David McCullough, the historian, says, to judge by what was in the newspapers, The signing never took place. There's a fellow named John Rogers, and I learned of this from Tom's book, that was the only delegate who voted for independence on July 2nd but did not sign. And George Reed of Delaware was a delegate who voted against independence, but then by August 2nd, he decided to sign the document. So August 2nd is a date that McMillan mentions as one that we should celebrate, just like July 4th. In fact, I don't know if celebrate's the right word, take note of. In fact, there's his book, the way that it's organized is kind of a neat way that you have these other dates to look at. What about the 2nd of July when the actual vote occurs? So at the 2nd of July, there's no going back. There's nothing between the 2nd and the 4th. There's no going back on the decision for independence after the 2nd of July. As we've talked about on this podcast before, John Adams thinks that that's going to be the day of independence. What about the 15th of May? It's when John Adams is able to push a vote advising colonial assemblies about creating their own governments. And it's approved May 10th. Not much fanfare. When Congress reconvenes on the Monday, May 13th, Adams presented an explosive preamble 3 times longer than the resolution it introduced. And so this is John Adams, his Declaration of Independence, sort of. Whereas His Britannic Majesty, in conjunction with the Lords and Commons of Great Britain, has by late Act of Parliament excluded the inhabitants of these united colonies from the protection of his crown, and whereas no answer whatsoever to the humble petitions of colonies for redress of grievances and reconciliation with Great Britain has been or is likely to be given, but from the whole force of that kingdom, aided by foreign mercenaries, is to be exerted for the destruction of the good people of these colonies. And whereas it appears absolutely irreconcilable to reason and good conscience for the people of these colonies not to take the oaths and affirmations necessary for the support of any government under the crown of Great Britain, and is necessary that the exercise of every kind of authority under the said crown should be totally suppressed, and all the powers of government exerted under the authority of the people in the colonies for the preservation of internal peace, virtue, and good order, as well as for the defense of their lives, liberties, and properties against hostile invasions and cruel depredations of their enemies, therefore resolved. It touches off 2 days of a lot of heat and debate. James Duane of New York, not a figure that we hear about, not a fan of independence. And he opened reading instructions from New York's Provincial Assembly, which barred New York delegates from voting for anything like independence. But he was reminded that Congress had already passed the resolution. This is a little trick that Adams does. This is all just a preamble, folks. I'm just adding some style to what you already approved. And then all the pro-patriot people speak in favor of the preamble. Congress proceeds with the vote on May 15th. The Maryland delegation now walks out. They could not give their assent to any proposition on independence. Let's see, there's no vote tally reported on this because it's about a preamble. Carter Braxton of Virginia does write a letter that says he thinks it carried by 6-4. John Adams tells a friend, "This day in Congress has passed the most important resolution that was ever taken in America." And he tells Abigail, "When I consider the great events which have passed and those greaters which are rapidly advancing, I may have been instrumental in touching some springs and turning some small wheels." So the 15th of May joins dates that one could note, and there's several other dates. So I'll go right now to the interview with Tom McMillan and not keep you any longer, but I just think that, it's interesting reading his book. So we can go over this period a lot more than we think then. And it might be a little nitpicky, but this is an important time to think about. All right, I'm here with Tom McMillan, the author of The Year That Made America. Thanks so much for coming on My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, Tom.
Bruce, great to be here. Thank you.
There's so many great revelations in this book. It's a topic that you think we'd be at the end of anything we could have knowledge about on this. I mean, we've had McCullough, we have Ellis, and I know that there are inspirations for you. And I was like, what else can you uncover? And then when I read this book, there's some neat things that you've still managed to go over the ground and pick up. For instance, I mean, what's written in the Jefferson Memorial, right, is not really apparently what Jefferson said.
Yeah. There's actually a phrase on the wall of Jefferson Memorial that was not written by Thomas Jefferson. So it was just a fun little. Does it matter? No, but it's a fun little tidbit. Everybody assumed that he wrote everything, and Congress actually did quite a bit of editing on the Declaration.
Got to throw another one at you from the middle of the book. This is from another historian that you quote that, considering how revered a position the Declaration of Independence later won in the hearts and minds of American people, their disregard for it in the early years of the new nation, as the rebellion's going on, as the revolution's going on, verges on the incredible.
That really struck me. I think that was Pauline Maier in her book who said that. But it makes sense. Sometimes we just don't think of these things, because the Declaration of Independence had done its duty by early 1777. It declared independence. There was still a war to win. You realize that had the colonists not won the war, no one would have even known the Declaration even existed. It would have been ripped up and forgotten about forever. So those folks, we hallow it later, but it gained in momentum as the years went on after America became independent. But right then, and you think of it, it makes sense. They couldn't dwell on that. They had to fight the British.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of good it would have done, right? Especially after New York and the Long Island debacle and everything. Yeah. A lot of good it would have done just to declare. And another thing about your book is the name of it, of course, is The Year That Made America. But your year, if I have this right, it's not a fixed 1 year like 1776. It's kind of like this part of 1 year going into another year.
Yeah, yes. The editor and I, debated that. One of my points was to just show people we focus so much on the 4th of July. And everything happened on the 4th of July. And it's like so much happened beyond the 4th of July to lead to this. This was a long process. And we kicked it. So my original title for the book was going to be July 2nd, 1776, just to kind of shock people. And Adams thought that should have been Independence Day. But, there's so much that led up to it. And you can't, to put it in some kind of context, I couldn't dwell on it too much, but so much happened in 1775. And and even before that, you have to deal with the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party. And the people have written entire books on those. I spent like a page and a half on each. But you can't just drop yourself into the middle of 1776. What I learned by doing this, to your earlier point, I thought I knew a lot about this. I was humbled by how little I knew, because we tend not to dig in, because of the 4th of July, we tend not to dig into the details about how this all happened. And that part of it was, so it's just an indication to the reader that this isn't just even about 1 year or one date. This was quite a undertaking by the colonists.
I mean, there are already guns firing. There's already fighting going on, especially the New England part. Some in Virginia before that that declaration is issued. I think it's have it here somewhere. Kevin Phillips wrote a whole book on 1775, and he tried to refocus it. I do think Kevin Phillips, I love him to death, but there's so much in his books that sometimes it's the opposite, like Trees for the Forest kind of thing. But he did try to move that to 1775. I'm always reading from that because, I mean, I'm even thinking about the Jefferson and Adams letters as they're like talking later, and they're talking about the events of 75. We, though, as moderns, think about 76. How much it is a result of that musical 1776, right?
I think absolutely. I say when I give my book talks, I talk about, we skim over this stuff in school. We really do. We move right from the Declaration to the war. And it was that musical, silly as it is, that got me thinking about that there were other things that happened. I mean, it's not very much based on history, but it has a couple of elements in there, and that's what people think. And that phrase, that whenever I said I was doing this book, people would say, "Sit down, John, for God's sake, John, sit down." The line from some people remember. And then the other thing that struck me, Bruce, too, was the John Adams series on HBO. That really got me thinking about this, really based on McCullough's book, very well done. Probably the deepest dive dive on video into the Declaration debate that's been done. There isn't really a good documentary on this. They tended the entire period in the war, and that got me thinking about this as well and researching.
Because the musical's not just entertaining, it was also used in education. It was, I know for myself, it was in my elementary school. We probably saw it twice. So it's definitely more than just that it's on TV a bunch of times. And it is one of the few things where people see the 76. But I want to talk about a figure that we don't talk about a lot, and maybe some people see it in a negative light, and that's John Dickinson. What should we think about him in the context of 75 and 76? And
we should have better thoughts of him than we do. And part of that is as good as it was, because the HBO miniseries was, Dickinson is not quite the villain, but he's portrayed as kind of, this guy didn't want independence. He is a fascinating figure. I mean, from the start, I mean, in the 1760s, he really wanted to protect American rights within the British Empire. He wrote anonymously the letters from a farmer that really had an effect on the colonies. In 1775, he did write the Olive Branch petition trying to get the king to redress our grievances, but he also wrote the causes and necessities for taking up arms. I mean, he wrote he and Jefferson wrote it. He wrote a stronger version than Jefferson. He argued against it. I don't think it was that he was against independence. I think he knew what was going to happen. He just didn't think it was proper at that time. He was being overly cautious. And yet, and this is the great lesson of Dickinson, I couldn't dwell on it, but I did mention it in the book, he doesn't vote for independence. He doesn't sign the Declaration of Independence. He fights in the Revolutionary War. Imagine our politicians today taking that up. He didn't go back and sign it later. So I think he really stuck by his guns. I admire that. We can disagree maybe with some of his points. That's fine. But he stuck by what he believed, and that's what we want in leaders. So I think he should be hallowed more than he is.
Yeah, interesting. I always will say that I did a whole little mini podcast on the signers, and I included a bit about Dickinson, and that's the one point we always have to remember is that,
and he probably made the radicals better. He probably made Adams better. Someone who challenges your thoughts, he made them adjust and go back and maybe readjust some things. So I think he had a contribution to the Declaration without overtly being part of writing the Declaration.
Well, I mean, when you look at it from a military standpoint, and then reconsider the debates of 75 and 76 in that context, you look at what happened militarily in the Revolution. It lasts 8 years. That's like longer than, well, it depends when you start the beginning of Vietnam, but that's like a Vietnam type struggle. We start out with several vicious defeats and a retreat of the army. I don't suspect that all of the people, say your Adams, say your Wilson, your people really supporting independence, were thinking that was going to be the first military event. Maybe Dickinson did realize that. There was some great moments, like the pulling of the cannon from Ticonderoga and kicking the British out of Boston, which had to be just a shocking moment and a celebratory moment. But a lot of the other battles, even over the entire length of the Revolution, they're either British wins or close deals, like your Monmouth and your Guilford Courthouse, say, or there's a few victories like Cowpens or Kings Mountains or thing. But it's always very tough victories to get. The British can move everywhere. They have naval superiority. So I almost just, when we look back at the hindsight of what happened in the military sphere, then you bring it back to all those debates, and maybe Adams and some other people were a little bit giddy.
I think I think most countries that go to war, you could say that. I think definitely that's the case. Dickinson, more than anyone, saw how long a struggle this was going to be. I don't think he saw the insurgency succeeding the way it did in that sense. I mean, it has to start at some point. And it did take a long time. But I think he accurately predicted how difficult this was going to be. The others may have been caught up in the excitement of declaring independence and what happened with Boston and a couple of the victories that this was going to, I don't think they thought it was going to be easy, but they thought it might have been quicker. So there's a point to be said for that. But having said that, you had to start at some point. If the longer you delayed, who knows if it had been delayed for a year, what would have happened? History would have changed forever. So, but I think his cautious points are well taken and stand up well in history.
Yeah, I have to agree. I think that the longer you wait, if Lord North stays in power, that government it's not going to get better for American colonists. In fact, I believe they had shown their propensity already to enact legislation and maybe and sometimes they withdrew things like the Stamp Act, but for PR purposes, but then they'd add others, and maybe you'd start to see more authoritative governors come on the scene, more officers, and yeah, I tend to agree with that. It had to happen when it happened.
Yeah, and I think the thing that struck me, it's obvious to you and me and people who are really into this, but it's good to remind the listeners how long it took for information to get across the ocean from one
Uh-huh.
side to the other. Decisions were made and you didn't know they were made. And they might have affected your decision had you known what the British did or what the Americans did. It really, we're so used to instantaneous communication today. It kind of blows your mind a little bit of how much they didn't know, how long they had to wait, for instance, to hear some of the king's speeches, what he said about them. It really, you shake your head. They were waiting for those mail deliveries, but didn't know they were coming.
I think you talk about in the book how when the king answers, the King George answers come to some of the petitions, it's much more aggressive than anyone realizes.
Llegaron los nuevos McCrispy Strips, listos para aventurarse en la mezcla de mayo ketchup, la barbecue que quedó en el fondo de la cajita, hot fudge sundae y en la nueva creamy chili McCrispy Strip dip. Los nuevos McCrispy Strips, ahora en McDonald's. Para pa pa pa.
Finding a new job is stressful. But with Indeed, it doesn't have to be. Just fill out your Indeed profile with your skills, experience, and desired salary. The more you fill out, the better your matches will be. And hearing from hiring managers will be 2 times more likely. Relax. That's your Indeed profile sending opportunities your way. Indeed, the world can work better.
Are you still quoting 30-year-old movies? Have you said cool beans in the past 90 days? Do you think Discover isn't widely accepted? If this sounds like you're stuck in the past. Discover is accepted at 99% of places that take credit cards nationwide. And every time you make a purchase with your card, you automatically earn cash back. Welcome to the now. It pays to Discover. Learn more at discover.com/credit card, based on the February 2024 Nielsen report.
If you were in London and you knew the politics, you would know that nobody was more for war than the king himself. But they were thinking maybe they can get a deal. And Lord North was not a puppet, but he's actually a decent politician himself. But he wouldn't be there without the support of the king. Let's put it that way. There was this mistake that in modern times, all right, we don't know everything about what Z or Putin are doing, but we would have more information. You'd read Foreign Affairs and they'd say, oh, actually, Z wants to do this. And
yeah, they were totally naive about that. He was, once the shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, this wasn't going to be a nice, easy, peaceful settlement. He said it in one of his letters, blows will decide this. He telegraphed. Before they sent a massive amount of troops, he telegraphed what was going to happen. And I think maybe people didn't read it closely, didn't believe him, whatever.
I think that if and this is a little speculation, which I won't take too long on, but if you try to get in the colonial mind, and they had fought in the French and Indian War, in which the Americans did the heavy lifting. I mean, yes, there were British soldiers, but most of the men were colonial, and they kind of, some of these people in their 20s had fought with the British in the French and Indian War, knew like, oh, they only sent 100 British and we had 1,000 colonial Virginia militia, fighting these wars. The statistics about the British Army were known, that it's mostly a naval power. It has the whole world to patrol. And if you didn't know that they were going to recruit mercenaries and the Hessians, the best in the world, and you might not know what was coming because everything they had sent before had been, ship, Concord, okay, we'll send a couple hundred men. And it always was these seemingly overpowerable armies. Then that moment when I always think about this, almost like a Star Wars movie, like that moment when the ships appear on the harbor in New York, and it's just an invasion fleet that probably these people in their grandfather's lifetime have not seen.
It had to be a breathtaking scene, scary, breathtaking scene.
Scary, breathtaking, and of course the initial fighting. I mean, really, a lot of the war was a lot of like run and then fight, run and then fight. I want to talk a bit about the authorship of the Declaration of Independence, because the image we have maybe from that 1776 musical is that Jefferson playing the violin and all of that, and
some of what we know of this period was written by, they didn't write a lot back then. They were more concerned with the war. It was written by Adams and Jefferson in the 1820s. They were there, their primary sources, but they're older men at that point. The story quoted is that Adams said, well, I said, you should write it, Thomas. You're a Virginian. I'm a Massachusetts. I'm obnoxious. You're popular. You're a great writer. Jefferson, meanwhile, writing separately, says, they just asked me to write it and I wrote it. I do think that what happened is that they didn't think, Adams thought the vote was most important, not the document. The document was a propaganda piece. They didn't think it was that important. I think years later, Adams was kicking himself when he saw how much credit Jefferson got, that he didn't write it himself. And I think that's where that came from. But yes, the writing part, there's a 5-man committee that's appointed with Adams and Jefferson and Franklin, and Jefferson gets your job, and they meet for the first time on June 11th. They turn it in on June 18th, June 28th. So you read a lot of places that it took Jefferson 17 days, which seems okay. Maybe it's a weighty document. Adams writes later, and I think he's correct, Jefferson wrote the original draft in 2 or 3 days. There's evidence that Adams has it that weekend. But back then, today we might call it plagiarism. Back then, they viewed that differently. You would take other things that other great writers had written and adapt them. He did that. He'd been working on this on his own. George Mason had written the Bill of Rights in Virginia just that month. It was printed in the Philadelphia paper. Words very close to what's in the Declaration of Independence. But Jefferson cranks this out in just 2 or 3 days. And then the committee starts to edit it. And they take a couple of weeks, and they make there were a total of 86 editorial changes made to Jefferson's original draft. We have it. The committee made about half of them, and they turned it in on June 28th. And then Congress, after the vote, takes parts of 3 days and does some really serious editing. They cut out almost 25% of it. They cut out entire passages that Jefferson wrote. They changed his wording. They rewrote the final paragraph, which to them was the most important paragraph. That's where they declared independence. We today focus on that second paragraph with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, self-evident truths. They breezed over that back then. The writing style in the 18th century was you built to a crescendo and you made your point at the end. So they declare independence at the very end, and Congress added some of their own phrases to strengthen that. They thought that was the most important paragraph. And that's where, to our anecdote earlier, that's where we have a phrase. One of those phrases is on the wall of the Jefferson Memorial in D.C., because when they're editing that in the 1940s, the President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he wanted to crack at it, and he knew the last paragraph was important. So he put some of those phrases in, not knowing, believing the myth that Jefferson wrote everything. And so right. Jefferson is the primary author. He deserves most of the credit. My book was edited. Every book is edited. The committee in Congress made some changes, some substantial changes, and we should recognize that. And it was, again, before this research, Bruce, I didn't know.
I mean, everything's edited. That's a substantial amount. Even the over 80 changes from the Congress. That's a pretty substantial contribution, though, and so it definitely puts Jefferson more in the possible role as draftsman.
Yes, that's a correct. That is a correct term.
Where Gouverneur Morris is on the Constitution, really, maybe a little more than that. Because
Jefferson was really, he was really squirming. He was there the 3 days they're editing his piece, and he was up in arms. And Franklin had to go over, put his arm around him, and tell him an anecdote. And Jefferson never got over it. for weeks and months after that. He would handwrite out his original version and handwrite the final version and send it to friends and say, which do you think is better? And they would say, oh, Thomas, yours is better. They mangled your work. But historians generally believe that Congress did a good job there. They improved. They took Jefferson's really good work and improved it.
All right. And a reminder, we're talking to Tom McMillan, an author of The Year That Made America from Rebellion to Independence, 1775 to 1776. Let's talk a little bit about where everything fits in today's politics a bit without really getting into politics today, because what you think about the American Revolution or what you think they thought really sends a lot about what we should be doing now, right? It would be silly to think that, or we'd really have to make a good argument for why we would live our lives and run our country in defiance of the guys in Independence Hall in 1776. So that kind of understanding is so important. What do you think that the American Revolution meant to them?
Probably, as today, we probably make a mistake if we generalize. I mean, I think everybody, the people in, that's what I think the folks in Massachusetts had different views than the folks in Georgia. They lived their lives differently. We end up having a Civil War 80 years later. I think they certainly, even Adams and Franklin and Jefferson, had no idea the impact they were making on the world. They couldn't predict the future. They were, it was very short term for them. I think the thing I got from it, though, I think I mentioned modern politics on about 4 pages of the 300 pages. I wanted to write history, not that, but you can't avoid it, is we've always had chaos. Was it always a 50-50 country? I don't know, but Adams himself said, as independence was building up in 75, 76, he thought the country was split into thirds. There were third British loyalists, a third what he called true blue radicals, and a third of the people in the middle, they would be our independent voters today who could be swayed either way and might go which way the wind was blowing. People asked, was July 4th celebrated during the war? A couple of places maybe, but it depends on whether the war was in your area. It depended on whether the British Army was there. To them, it was freedom from tyrannical rule. I think they all agreed with that. What that was going to mean, I don't know. And a quote from Adams, I don't have it memorized, but I used it at both the beginning and the end of the book. Adams issued a warning that, posterity, don't mess this up, basically. He knew that there was a possibility that we would mess it up. But he said he'd be upset that he spent all this energy if we do that. I think they knew they were unleashing a great power. They just didn't know what was going to become of it. They couldn't predict it. I think they would have been astonished that it lasted this long.
Yes, certainly, because there was no history of anything else. You had the Dutch, but the Dutch also had times when a stadtholder or someone else would take them over.
And who knows? I mean, Thomas Paine, one of his most common sense lines in the book Common Sense was, an island can't rule a continent. Look at us, look at them.
Right.
And I think people started to think of that. And yet the United States was only 13 colonies back then, and then it gets to the Mississippi River. And who could have predicted, I'm just reading a book right now with Lewis and Clark, that would have happened. The Louisiana Purchase. I mean, John Adams and Benjamin Franklin and those guys John Dickinson could not predict that was going to happen. Maybe we end up like Europe here, and there are 7 different countries in what's now the United States. They couldn't have predicted that.
Yeah, well, Paine is interesting because if you go with his predictions, he wasn't totally right. He wanted a funded Navy, which I think that was a good idea that we didn't fully execute on. But the other thing was that an island can't rule a continent. And it was a great phrase, but the thing is, with a hired Hessian army, they very well could have. They very well could have.
And John Adams said of Paine, he was, again, a little jealousy here. John Adams, by the way, is my favorite founder, but he was very green and very jealous. I think he doesn't get the credit he deserves, and he was upset that he didn't get the credit that he deserved. He was upset a little that Paine was getting so much credit. I didn't like Paine, and he said he was better at tearing down than building up, which may have been true. I mean, Paine's plan for the country, for Congress, would not have worked, as you said. Adams's was better, but I think they're all, the way we viewed it, there were, as there would be today, there were political jealousies back then, and I think Adams just always said, he to me was the driver. He was the most important person in this process, Yet we talk about Paine and we talk about Jefferson more than we talk about Adams. And as he's writing in the 1800s, especially the 1820s, you can tell this is coming out of him. And he wrote so well that some of his stories, historians have picked them up, like the one about his conversation with Jefferson, which Jefferson says never happened, by the way. So who knows? Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. But it's fascinating reading, and writers tend to do it. It's always, I'm sure I did it a little bit. Writers, you always have to try to check those primary sources. We're all a little guilty because you can't check every little word in a 300, 400 page book. But I think we're a little guilty of doing that.
I enjoyed reading some of the Jefferson Adams letters directly. Adams starts with Jefferson at one of the years of their writing and says, I've given up on politics. I don't read newspapers anymore. I'm reading science and philosophy like you are. And probably 3 letters later, he's back to this guy wronged me. Look at him getting he took the attention. They'll write about him. He's always very flattering to Jefferson because Jefferson's the recipient in those letters. But point, like, it's a big East Coast. And they had to keep making it look continental, right? So because Massachusetts was the strongest for independence, there was always this, starting with the choice of Jefferson of Washington for the general. There was always this choice of, well, we gotta make this look a little more continental, than it is. And I know there was always jealousy of the Massachusetts generals. In that way, if Adams had come from Maryland or Virginia, maybe he would get his role, but they could only honor so many Massachusetts folks.
It's another thing to today, too. Regional rivalries existed then as today, and didn't know each other very well back then. So, people from Massachusetts had never traveled to Georgia.
That's right.
Yeah, travel the country and experience those things. Like, they most of them, even these guys, these learned, wealthy men who were in Congress, had not traveled very much until they started going to Philadelphia.
And your point to the chaos, I think, is a key, because we want that moment where someone defines like what this was and what it meant to everybody. You're just not going to get it. You can grab as much as you want. And I know there's a quote in your book from Adams where he says to the effect of like, this is probably going to have to happen where we vote for independence, but there's not states yet. Not everybody had a state. I think one thing I always point out to people is that the Continental Congress is the one that tells New Jersey to make a state. It had not been a state until the Continental Congress asked all the colonies you're going to have to become states and you're going to have to govern. And so there's this, we're going to have to fight a war, declare independence, become states, start governing. And so when you try to answer something philosophical, which comes up in debates, ferocious debates on the internet's made everything that we thought was settled more ferocious. Like, which came first, the states or the independence? Independence as a nation, independence as 13 states, which came first. That's a hot debate when you want to get into neo-Civil War debates and things like that.
Absolutely. And Adams, as you mentioned, Adams had a nice, neat plan for how this would all lay out. Mm-hmm. It didn't happen that way because it can't. It's not a test tube. Other thing, this is also creating foreign alliances, which he knew was important. What he said made a lot of sense. It was just going to be impossible to do it in a methodical manner the way he chose, and things got out of control, and they just had to react. So they did it kind of backwards in the way that he thought. But that was, when you look at it, that was natural. It was a nice thought, but it was never going to happen the way Adams wanted it.
So I'll ask you this. I asked a bunch of questions, but what do you think? Is there something that you think people need to know?
To me, the underlying fact is just that I go back to this thing with the 4th of July, the focus on the 4th of July. There were so many dates. There's a reason why I don't have a chapter titled the 4th of July. But right. I do have chapters titled the 9th of January, the 15th of May, the 7th of June, the 28th of June, the 2nd of July, for that reason, to kind of underscore the fact this was a long process. And if the events of any of those dates had not happened, history would have changed, perhaps dramatically. Mm-hmm. July 4th, what they did in July 4th was approve the Declaration. That's really all that happened that day. But the reason I give a talk, people say, well, why do we focus so much on July 4th? After that day, they sent it out to the printer. And they sent printed copies, which were not signed until August. The first printed copy was not signed by anyone, handwritten. And those were published in local papers and read in town squares. Many people heard this for the first time by readings in town squares. The first line it said was, "In Congress, July 4th, 1776." That's the first line at the top of the Declaration. That's why July 4th became Independence Day over all the others. It's understandable, but John Adams always thought it should be the 2nd of July when they voted. If it happened today, it would be the 2nd of July, because that we would view that as the most important act. But again, without instantaneous information, 99.9% of the country did not know the vote on July 2nd happened when it did. There was a little line in the Philadelphia paper, one of the Philadelphia papers that night. That was the only publicity. They didn't announce it. So the declaration was a few days later. And that's kind of what the process of the book. This was a long, fascinating process that I think most of us don't know. And I was fascinated to learn all these things that I didn't know.
Well, great. And the book is The Year That Made America. Tom McMillan, thanks so much for joining us. I know you also have a Antietam podcast.
Yeah, we do have a Civil War buff. A friend of mine have an Antietam and Beyond podcast, and have lots of interests. It was interesting diverting into the Revolutionary War and the Declaration here with the 250th, but I do a lot in the Civil War, and Antietam and Beyond is our little podcast on that consequential battle.
Well, thanks so much for coming on My History Can Beat Up Your Politics.
Bruce, my pleasure. Thank you.
I'm Howard Dory.
And I'm Jess Dory.
And we host Plotting Through the Presidents. We take deeply researched, deeply irreverent dives into the myths, mysteries, and scandals of the men and women who shaped America.
Join us as we dive deep into topics like
the undeniable riz of Aaron Burr.
The what now?
And the odd feeding habits of everyone's favorite founder,
John Adams.
Subscribe and follow Plotting Through the Presidents now to plot along with us.
Find out more at plodpod.com.